Okay, so welcome back to Scale Modelling Weekly, and in this episode we're going to just have a look at an advanced decaling tutorial, carrying on from one that I did a while ago for the sort of more basic techniques. And this unfortunately will mark the end of this series, so this season. So we're only going to have 5 episodes for this one. Unfortunately, with everything that's going on in the way things are at the minute, it has meant I've had to change a few of the things that I do. So we'll be back with another season very shortly. Now, first off, a big thing for me for decaling to get better results is to cut around the carrier film. So what I'm doing here is this decal is actually one whole bit with the circle logo and the writing, and I've cut around the writing and cut around the circle and then placed it separately, and you can see that there's no carrier film in between. So that instantly helps you straight off. So that's just one quick little tip, and we'll revisit that again later in this video. And then the first thing here for this P40, obviously being the shark's mouth, the big thing is the placement of the shark's mouth. Now this, I would say, is a advanced technique. You're going to struggle if you've only put on a couple of decals to get this on the way it should be, and it really just takes a lot of time. You're just going to make sure you keep a lot of moisture around the decal and on the model. Everything flows a lot better if it's wet with the decals, and you just need to keep moving it and keep trying to get it in line. Now here I'm having enough trouble just getting it off the backing sheet, but this is what you've got to do. You just got to conform to what the decal needs and work with it, especially with something like this, because it's iconic. It's what everyone's going to be looking at when they look at this model, is the shark's mouth. So obviously I'm way off here with placement, but giving it time and moving it here, there and everywhere, it does actually come together pretty well in the end. Now I use a lot of tools. I'm using my finger here, which is that's a wet finger doing that. I'm also using the pliers and a brush as well. So it all depends on what's best for whichever scenario. So once you've got it roughly placed, the other thing you've got to think of is it's not just how it looks on the side, it's got to curve around the underneath of the nose. Thankfully, Airfix have actually done their work here, and it does fit perfectly. As long as you spend your time, it does actually come together, but I'm sure other ones may not be done so well. So it does come down to a bit of the design as well with it. And obviously, if you'll see later, one of these decals doesn't actually go on at all, and it never will. So you've got to sort of pick your battles, I guess. Luckily, this one paid off, and I could see it was going to come together okay from the beginning, because it roughly fit in the right areas. I just had to manipulate it. So again, all I'm using here is this is warm water. Very important to use warm water, and just moving that into place and trying very hard to keep all of the points lined up. So I wanted the rear of that mouth to be in along that panel line, but I also need the front of it to come down along the panel line in a different way as well. So this here, making sure it joins up on the underneath, is again another important bit. And there you go, it does actually come together very nicely. And just final touches now, as it's starting to go off, it comes in nicely there across the top. And another tip, a lot of people would use micro set for this instead of water, and it might go off a bit too quick. I prefer to use water, and then when it's placed, use the micro set over the top of it, and it will soak through the decal and then have the same effect and help with the adhesion. If you go straight with it, I found sometimes the decals start to set a bit too quickly for my liking. But there you go, once it's in position, it's you just final touches and then actually apply your micro set and your micro sole, and it melts down lovely. It really beds in quite well. Now I mentioned a lot of it is to do with the design of the decals themselves, and unfortunately Airfix have actually not got this right here at the back, because this red band is meant to go straight around the fuselage, and you may notice it being cut as a straight line means it's never going to actually go around that fuselage in any sensible manner. So another advanced technique would be knowing when not to waste your time using a decal. You could spend a huge amount of time trying to get this sorted and it's never going to look right. So the best thing to do is just take it off, cut your losses, screw it up, use it as a guide. I mean, I'm being a bit over the top here, and actually spray it on yourself. And something like a red band on the fuselage is simple enough. And there we go. That was very painless, and it's on, and we don't need to worry about it, and we can move on to the next stage. So it's always best to, like I said, pick your battles. Now here, I actually broke this decal on the tail there, where I was bending it a bit too much. So this is something that happens as well. You can have decals, if they disintegrate when they hit water because they're poor quality, you can't do very much about that, I'm afraid. But if you get this, where it's a good quality decal, but it's just cut, this is how I would go about it. I'd get the main decal on and in position, and then use the other part, which is much smaller, the end of the tail, but it makes the point on this, and just place that on like I'm doing here and position it. And if you take your time and aren't too rough with it, it's no problem. Same principles apply here, making sure that it's moist and movable. I've actually broken a tiny little orange bit off of there, which I was trying to use, and then realised that was not going to work. And so just position it roughly, get it in the right area. We've got a panel line running more or less across the join, so we can clean that up once it's all settled in. And then the idea is to leave that and let it set and go off, and then start trying to plaster on your setting solutions. And again, very important. So this 4 and this 7 is one large piece of carrier film, and it's 100 times better cutting those two apart, separating them, and removing all of that carrier film. So this is what I'm doing here. I'm doing it by freehand, but obviously you could use a ruler and you'd be a lot better off. But you know, I like to take chances with things, and with what I've got there, it came out okay. So I've left the carrier film inside the 4 because that's not an issue. What would be the problem is the edges at the bottom and the top of the 4 and the 7. So that's what I'm trying to get rid of, and this is very effective doing it like this. The carrier, you know, the thickness of the decal is still there, but it kind of, you miss it when you look at it. It's sort of a trick of the eye, because you think a 7's meant to be there. You don't really see the slight ridge, whereas when there's a block holding the two together, it does show up quite a lot. So something to bear in mind. But if you are going to do this is again an advanced technique, because you'll find that it's a lot simpler for the decal to curl up. So the reason they join the 4 and the 7 like that is most modelers aren't going to worry at all about it. And then here the block would be on, whereas the 7 was actually quite difficult to manipulate, even to get it off the sheet and onto the model. So that's the reason it's done like that, if you were wondering. So that it is what I would class an advanced technique to cut these out and move them around like that. And as you can see, this is me still trying to get the 7 up. This is in real time. I'm there trying to manipulate it, and it's probably curling all around the tweezers, but eventually I get there and we can bring it on. And luckily here it was as simple as just lining the top of the 4 and the 7 to that panel line, and that ensured that it was in the right placement. And that gives you a much better result. So if you know your way around decals and you've been doing it for a while, I'd highly recommend trying out these sort of techniques, because they're very, very useful, and the result is extremely good in my opinion. And it cuts out a lot of the problem that you can get from these things. So there we go, it's lined up. And now we're just having a look around, and I would say once you've used your setting solutions, it's best to check around, and then if then the decals haven't set in, then push them in with something. So I've used a pin in the past. Here I'm using an old airbrush needle, and I'm just dragging very gently across the panel line. Now it's important to do this when the decal is dry. You wouldn't want to put setting solution on and then start dragging it, because you can find it softens the decal and you may catch it and tear it. And you also want to get a feel for the decal as well, because you really can, if you do this wrong, you can hook into it and it will tear it. So you want to be very careful. I've already cut through these with a sharp blade, so I know they're separated, and I've used setting solutions on them many times to make sure they're bedded down. So I'm quite confident that if I just run through the panel line, especially these being the Airfix panel lines, it's going to go in nicely, and you get a feel for it. So I would, as always, try this on a test piece before doing this to your favourite model with the one set of decals that you've got. I wouldn't go doing this straight off thinking, oh, Jason did it and it's going to be fine. I won't be held responsible. But here we go, just running across the rest of it, and I always think it's important to try and get every single bit of the insignia into the panel lines. That's how I personally like to do it. And we can see that there with the Tiger now. It's looking quite good. And I've done it, and it's also very good with the rivets here. I've done a little bit of it on as well. It's just pushing the pin in to make the hole. Now another big thing with decaling is decaling onto a matte coat. So I thought we'd do that here. So this is a tank turret. It's been sprayed in Tamiya paints, and I don't even think I added a matte coat. This is just straight Tamiya acrylic, and I'm going straight onto it here. So this is Ryfield models. Now I have cut around the 1 and the 2 again, so I'm doing that thing just to assume I've cut around all of the decals in these tutorials from now on. And I'm going to go ahead and add these on. And I must admit, I didn't find it any more difficult really using it on a matte coat than a gloss coat. You did need a lot more moisture because it does tend to bite in a little bit more, I must admit. But nevertheless, there wasn't any problem. And these were quite matte decals as well. So in that respect, I feel it actually worked quite well. If you had very glossy decals and you were using them on a matte coat, you may have a little bit more of an issue. I'm not sure. It might be in the aftermath when you overcoat them. But you may notice compared to the previous model that it's taken a little bit more to manipulate these and move them around, which actually could be a good thing, because I have had it in the past where decals slide around a bit too easily. So there's pros and cons to all of it, but I didn't find it wasn't any real sort of disaster, and oh my god, I've used a matte coat and put decals on it and they're a disaster. I think they were absolutely fine. Now you've got to remember, the idea around all of this is silvering. That's the main issue. The idea is a gloss coat helps with silvering. I don't think it's really the gloss that's doing much to it, if I'm honest. I think it's the smoothness of the paint coat. You can have a rough gloss coat and a smooth matte coat. So it all depends on how smooth the paint is. So here I'm applying micro set straight onto the paint again. There wasn't any staining either. It worked fine. So that's another thing, that it can be an issue with staining. Now I do get a little bit of silvering as we go forward. And that is actually more due to my terribly rough paint job, because I wasn't actually going to do this as a demo piece. And the turret has actually gone on very smoothly. But when we get onto the hole, I've blasted the paint on there, and it's made it quite rough. And I didn't sand it back, but I thought it would be good to show you that anyway. So it's worth looking at. It is a problem in that sense, but I don't think a gloss coat would have helped it. It's just about having air underneath the decal, and that's easily done if you've got a rough coat. So because it gives it more air pockets, I think that's the idea. Then it gives that silvery look on top, which is called silvering. So I'm pretty happy now with that 1 and the 2 to make up that 12 on the side of the turret. It's looking pretty good, so I let that sit in now. Now this is one of the ones that I did get a little bit of silvering. However, I managed to get rid of it in the actual decaling phase. It was just on that ridge, so it's where it sits up a little bit. And again, I've cut the triangle and the free. Now, I would have had a better time of it, I think, if I cut the carrier film out of the middle of the triangle, because that was causing an issue. It being a very matte decal, it tended to show some of the issues off a little bit more. That's what I was feeling anyway. That was my view of it. But anyway, forcing it down and using setting solutions gave us a good finish, I feel. And I did get there in the end. It was pretty good. And again, the smooth paint was on the turret, like I said. As we get to the rear deck of the hull, it's a bit of a different story. And there you can see the 12. There's no silvering there. It's no problem. It's gone on there. Absolutely fine. I did notice that the 1 was a little bit wonky, so I've re-wetted that and got back under it, and I'm just kind of moving that out again just to make sure it's straight, because once it's set there's no changing it, and it did stand out a little bit to me, you can rework these decals, and if you use a bit of micro set, it will liven them up a little bit again. But just note that when you're doing that, you're in the sort of danger territory, so don't be surprised if you've already used setting solutions, come back an hour later trying to move a decal. It might be too soft and you might tear it up. But you never know. This worked out okay. Now, I've been mentioning the rear deck, and there where we've got that star, it's the carrier film in between the star and the round bars on the outside. And you'll see the silvering in a minute. But the insignia there on the front and the unit insignia is gone on okay, and there on the back, where that little bit of silvering was, it's gone fine as well. And here we are. So that's now been overcoated with a matte coat to seal that in after using the setting solutions, and it looks fine. It's one less coat that I've had to put on. That's the way to look at it, really. Tiny bit of silvering that I was pointing out there in the middle of that free, mainly where I've been a bit rough cutting this carrier film out. So if you take a bit more time and you get really tight to the coloured part of the decal, you shouldn't have too much of a problem. Just something to bear in mind. But here we go, we'll look at this one again. Now, I've actually gone over that with some riveting wheels and got quite a lot of micro set in underneath it. And I've done a little bit more again since I've been videoing this. You can see where the roughness is. You can see the rough paint either side of it. It's terrible, really. I should have sort of sanded it back a bit. Interestingly, these have actually gone down on the cast texture, and it's no problem. And that obviously is very rough. And you can see there again with the nameplate on the side, it's not too bad at all. So it's not the case, in my opinion, that decaling onto a matte coat is going to result in silvering. It all just comes down to the smoothness of paint, if you ask me. And a gloss coat doesn't guarantee the smoothness of the paint. I don't think that star at the back would have been any different on a gloss coat. I think it was just extremely rough paint. And here, just looking again at that hawk, just checking about how we get into those panel lines and what it looked like. And there you go, it's very effective. I like nothing more than the panel lines cutting right through the decals. So hopefully this has been of interest, and apologies if you were hoping for 10 episodes. Like I say, life is sort of, work life is caught up with me. We could have gone one or two ways, I think, with this old lockdown that's happening. It could have either been plenty of time on my hands or no time at all, and it has gone a little bit busy at work, so I'm out of time a little bit. But I have finished this, and it doesn't mean the channel's going to stop. It just means the intensity of the amount of videos is probably going to slow down a bit. But rest assured, we'll be carrying on as normal, and there'll be more videos going up. So stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video.